Thank you all for coming. I've got 3 projects which I'm going to talk through tonight, which are all contrasting and are all linked to landscape. And I wanted to just start by contextualizing myself. I started gardening young, at the age of 5 or 6. And when I was about 10, we moved to this house, which was a very simply built, modestly built arts and crafts house in Hampshire. And at that stage, it was completely overgrown. And what was interesting about this acre of garden was that it had become a wilderness over, we think, about 50 years. And the old lady, Miss Joy, who lived there, had lived there with rats. There were rat holes under every single door, and kibia vine, which she got underneath the skirting boards and wrapped around the furniture. And this is me and my brother exploring, and of course it was complete paradise to us as kids. And my parents, who were keen gardeners, but not as keen as I became, spent the next few years clearing the garden and realizing that underneath this undergrowth was this vision that somebody else had created. Miss Joy had started planting it in the early 1900s, and by the time we got there in the mid-1970s, her vision had overwhelmed her, and the woodland had crept back in, and her garden was all but lost underneath what it had become. And I learned very quickly that what we had to do, and this is me in the old rose garden, was that I had to strike a balance between what we could do there in terms of our energies and what was possible in terms of the balance between energy and the power of the nature that had overtaken this acre. So it became this balancing act that I became very fascinated in, and the idea of gardening on the wild side was something that I learned quite quickly to try and steer or to be part of. So I became interested in people like Beth Chatto, who were already looking at gardening with wild plants and gardening in a way that was looking to choose the right plant for the right place. So for me, it was a fantastic education, gardening at Hill Cottage and learning about this fine tuning that you have to do to not compete with nature, but to work with it. And all my work really has been a result of those early years. I spent a lot of time traveling. I trained as a horticulturalist, not as a designer, because I knew I always wanted to design gardens. And it became very clear to me early on that it wasn't just a case of growing plants, it was actually putting them together and contextualizing them that would allow me to do what I wanted to do. So I trained at Wisley and at Kew and Edinburgh Botanics, and I spent a year in Jerusalem Botanical Gardens, going out and looking at landscape and learning to read landscape, with a view to understanding it really wholeheartedly so that I could work anywhere I wanted. And I now run a small practice in London. There's 9 of us. And I'm based in Waterloo and splitting my time between Waterloo and a piece of land which I've got over near Bath. And that balance between the 2 places is really very stimulating in terms of the contrast. I wanted to start with a project called Folly Farm, which for me was a fascinating thing to be offered because it is a Lutyens property, which is just near Reading, and it's a 22-acre site, which includes these fields that wrap around it to the west, and then a very inward-looking garden, which here's the main building, the Lutyens building, which was built over 12 years, and he went back there twice. He did the first section in the early 1900s and then went back in 1911 with a new vision that had been inspired by his trips to Delhi in India, and a much more confident vision in terms of his architecture. But what he created here was a very inward-looking garden, a series of garden rooms that was contained by hedges rather than walls, and looked inward rather than outward, because the landscape in this part of Berkshire is very subtle It's not like the rolling landscape that he was often working with in Surrey, so the views were limited. And he chose for the gardens to look in. So he worked with Jekyll once again, and it was, some say, one of his best collaborations with her. By the time we got there in 2010, nearly 100 years later, the garden was exhausted. The two previous owners had maintained the garden, not gardened the garden. And as we all know, the garden really is the gardener. It's who's looking after it. And gardens can very quickly fall into a state of, they can become very limited if you don't pour resources and care into them. And this is what had happened. And we were left with a dilapidated landscape, or hard landscape, and a garden which was a series of garden rooms created by old hedges with not very much happening in them. And the client was very clear with me, and when she interviewed me for the job, she said, how would you approach it? And I said, well, I think it would be a great mistake to try and preserve something, an aspic, which has already diminished and vanished. And we should take the inspiration from the arts and crafts movement and that collaboration of Jekyll and Lutyens and move it forward into the next century. The garden was nearly 100 years old, and the client's aim was for it to be complete by the time it was. And one of the things that I wanted to do, because I'm interested in landscape and I'm interested in this connection between nature and the garden, was to make the garden which was inward-looking into a garden which became outward-looking. And these two diagrams show how the garden, when we arrived, was really very much about these rooms that looked in, and all the land around it was left out. So we reconfigured a drive which went right the way through the landscape. We put in a lake as something to hold the eye and draw your eye out, and created all these ways out into the landscape that started to include it, rather than turn your back on it. And although the landscape is subtle there, it's something which we've included in a very positive way to the experience of those inward-looking spaces. These are the old gardens, the old plans, of Jekyll and Lutyens. And this is our revised plan to show how we're moving the garden into the future. There were some spaces which were never finished. They think that Lutyens exhausted the client financially, and which he was notorious for doing. He was actually able to stay at this place, so he never fell out with this client. He stayed there for a whole summer once with his family. But he was able to, I think, probably get them to a point where they said, okay, that's enough. So the garden had a weak chin, and you can just see Jekyll's sketch here of possibly a croquet lawn, possibly a tennis court. But this ended up being a space which actually started to break down and be nothing. So you came out of these enclosed spaces and entered spaces which were very unresolved and poorly resolved in a way. So that was one of our big jobs. And the client didn't want us to preserve it. So we had to look in aspic, but we did have to look very carefully at what we needed to do to strike the balance between it being a restored garden and a refreshed garden, rather than a restoration project. So what we looked at here was, there were two parts of the project. The first was looking at the hard landscaping, and it was absolutely fascinating because when you go to look at something like a Lutyens garden and house, you look at things with an architectural eye, possibly, but you never really look at all the details that he would have gone through to create those spaces in a three-dimensional way. And because we had to take everything apart, brick by brick, and put it back together again, we really learned how he'd looked at these spaces and in the ingenious ways that he'd coped with the slope, for instance, by planting the slopes with hedges so that he didn't have to put retaining walls in to make certain parts of the building works cheaper, how he put the detail into things that showed, and how he created these series of water features with this tremendously laborious water sequence, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So we had two projects on the go, one with a series of contractors that looked at restoring the hard landscaping. And here you can see some of the projects underway. This is the raised white garden with these old walls around it. And this strange pool in the centre, which at one point was filled with hostas. We had old pictures from the country life because it was obviously leaking. And we dug it out and found that it had to be completely rebuilt. And the client's vision for this property was, Jonathan said to me, he said, I want this garden to be to look like it has been maintained for every single day of its 100-year life, and which was a brilliant brief, really, because it didn't mean that we'd go in and do a huge hit to refresh everything. It needed to look like it had been worn and there had been patina allowed to still be there. So we had to painstakingly leave certain things in walls that were growing. We had to leave the moss and the lichen where we could. We had to only lift the slabs that needed it. We went to the Bank of England and got this, when they were selling off some old limestone, we got this amazing old reclaimed limestone, which meant that we didn't see where the new limestone was used. And where we, DPS, Dan Pearson Studio, made our new interventions, we then used new limestone and simplified everything that we did so that it wasn't trying to emulate Lutyens. It was using his work as an inspiration. So we weren't wanting to make a pastiche with anything new, but we were wanting to keep the patination that was built into this garden through it being there for so long, and that's a very gentle thing that you have to do. And we work very closely with skilled craftsmen to do this. So this is the White Garden after we'd refilled this beautiful little pool and put a fountain in. We realised that once had been a fountain many, many years before. And then we refreshed the plants which were still there, very carefully repruned this wisteria and replaced the arbour and new furniture. So in a way it looks like we haven't been there, and the client now says in a way there's a sense of disappointment for people when she's showing them around the garden, because nobody believes that we spent 4 years restoring this garden from scratch and a considerable amount of money doing that. So these are the beautiful steps being dismantled piece by piece. Everything had to be numbered and photographed and put back together, countless photographs for the records. And these are the steps when they're refreshed, looking as beautiful as they did, perhaps better than when Lutyens made them, because of course you've got that patination as well. We had to restore the hedges, and they'd got to a perilous state of falling apart, and trying to convince a client who knew a certain amount about gardens, but not as much as we did, obviously, that you needed to be brutal with your yew hedges, was a big act of faith. So this is the first hedge being sheared back on one side. So for those of you who don't know, yew hedges can be restored over 6 years by shearing one side very hard back to the trunk, leaving it to regrow for 2 years, so that the top and the other side feed that regrowth, and then you shear the other side in 2 years' time, and then 2 years after that you then shear the top. And you get a restored hedge, which comes back eventually. You have to feed it, of course. So we went into a process of restoring the hedges, and that's now on a rota, restoring all the hedges around. But our first main project that we did was to start to draw the eye out into the landscape. And this is the lake positioned beyond the boundaries of those inward-looking hedges, to create a focal point for a new drive, which would come through this way, rather than a drive which ended up being at the back of the house. Lutyens had originally intended the front door to be down at this end of the house. And this little road, the Salmstead Road that ran by, very quickly over 2 or 3 years became unusable when the motor car became fashionable. So the back entrance was used, and the front door was stopped being used. And then my clients, had terrible trouble trying to convince English Heritage that they needed to reconfigure the front door in a different place. And Jennifer went into this great big huge long-winded process of proving that the front door could be put in a different place through doing these analysis on the project. So by the time we got there, we were able, with her hard work, to put this new road in that went through the landscape, so you got glimpses of the house before you arrived at it. And we used that pond, we're not allowed to call it a lake, as a focal point. So this is the site of the pond going in, and these are the beginning of some gentle berms which we made around the pond to hold it and make it feel like it was in a natural depression. This is a very flat piece of land, so we used all the spoil to create these berms that were then planted. It's a very windy site, and we needed to screen the site from this southwesterly wind, which raged across it and dried this very shallow soil out that was over shingle beds. So this is the pond going in. This is the liner, and then this is 1 year later, after the pond has been planted up with purely with English natives, nothing foreign, and the meadows replanted with purely English species. The idea with this 14 acres, I think it is, of landscape that we've taken beyond the boundaries of the ornamental gardens is that they're going to be rich in ecology, rich in wildlife, and a huge sort of heart of new life for the ornamental gardens that lie within the enclosed hedges. And this is the lake from the other direction. Drawing the trees, those old hedge trees which mark the ancient hedge lines that ran through this part of the ground, back into the watery surface to give you this focal point in the garden that allows this perambulation out into the landscape and a reason for going out into the landscape and beyond the boundaries of the ornamental garden. The next project we moved on with was taking a watercourse from the lake down the outside of the ornamental gardens, which are here, right the way through the site and out through to the stream. There were small springs which ran through the site, which fed a tiny ditch, which finished about here. So we picked up that ditch and we made a watercourse, which then created a metaphorical moat, really, between the ornamental gardens and the wild gardens beyond it. It was a very nice way of actually making these two spaces linked but separate. And these are glimpses of the house from a distance, and that ditch being extended into a watercourse, which you can see here looking back the other way, has a series of weirs which allows the water to drop from one space to the next. So you get an acoustic change as the water moves down through the garden. So you've got the sound of water following you as you move through the space, in a space that was previously without any sound and without any ornamentation for your ear. So this is a very simple thing to do, but an enormous gain. And this is the ditches filled up now with those weirs. You can see sliding through the garden, separating the landscape garden and the parkland beyond from the ornamental gardens on the inside. And this is the ditch 2 years after it was planted, showing Iris Gerald Derby, which is a North American native, a really good form of this flag, very similar to our yellow flag, which has inky coloured stems. And during the winter, we've got the sealing wax red stems of the willows which line it, which pick up the red of the roof in the distance. So just playing with very simple ideas and doing it very boldly. And this is the ditch extending through to the very edge of the garden, where the Asters, who'd been one of the residents, had previously had a swimming pool. And we created a very simple westerly looking garden here, just with a simple lawn, which is one day going to house a sculpture. And the moat coming up alongside a wall, which then becomes a ha-ha, and a new set of steps, which is inspired by a set of steps in the garden, and we call these ziggurat steps. They're made from solid sleepers of Portland stone. It's a very different way of making the steps from the more intricate way of the creasing tiles and stone slabs that Lutyens used. But we've been inspired by him and then used something, a much more simple way of building things, which reflects the difference between this modern rendition of a Lutyens garden. So it's a very simple space, just able to look out west, so you get the sunsetty views looking out over the meadows. And this is the boundary of the ornamental garden and the meadows beyond it. So now we're going into the garden to show you what these inward-looking spaces look like. And this is the sunken pool garden. And Jennifer said to me, what should we do about the planting? How are we going to do this? So we went through Jekyll's planting plans, which were almost indecipherable. Her writing was hard to read. They were sketchy. There were things which I wouldn't want to use now. We're 100 years later. And we've got a whole series of things which she would have loved to have used, I'm sure, had she survived that long. And we said, okay, imagine what would she have done if she'd lived for another 100 years and used all that inspiration that she'd started off with, using plants in a very painterly way. So my style of planting, which is naturalistic and painterly in a way, It fits very comfortably with its arts and crafts style that she was using. And one of the things that she did as she moved around the garden was to use each of these garden rooms as a colour palette. So she had this colour wheel that she moved around the space. We never knew what the colour palette was within the sunken pool garden, because these old country life pictures don't really show this garden ever looking particularly good or at its best. It's an extremely strong Lutyens design with this very powerful geometric shape. You can see him on the drawing board, can't you, with his compasses there, playing and enjoying that space. It's a sunken pool garden with a pool in the middle. And we never really saw it looking ever at its best in those old archive pictures. But what I decided I'd do is to allow this space, which is completely enclosed. You can't see it from the garden, only from the house, from the sleeping balcony outside the master bedroom here. That's the only room that looks down into it. So it's a very private space in many ways. So we've put the hottest, fieriest colours down in there and been inspired by this idea that Lutyens has spent time in India. So we were using these colours in this space which were inspired by heat and warmth and light and robustness of colour, which would be a contrast to this gardens immediately around it. So this is the mood boards which we created to show the clients in our working process with them how we were going to treat this. And then I found that geometric formation in that space extremely difficult on the eye. It's very competitive, and what my planting I decided should do was be like a textile which was rolled over the whole space, which was one continuous piece, that then the hard landscaping was almost cookie-cutted out of. So the hard landscaping then became something that was abstracted or laid into this continuous thing which moved over it. So these beds, which are all quite bitty and separated from each other, became very much a linked piece. So we swept a planting over the space. This is the restored space with the garden mended. Huge holes in the hedges where the Astor swimming pool had leaked and killed the hedges with the chlorine. So this is part of our hedge restoration. And this is the garden going in and the client looking down and wondering what on earth she's committed to. And this is the garden 1 year later, looking back at the house with these fiery colours used as pinpricks of colour, like a pointillist painting, within this gauze of straw-coloured grasses, which make that link in your mind back out to the meadows beyond. This is a detail showing how the gauziness of those grasses act as a veil. So you see the hard landscaping through a veil. In a mysterious way, it's revealed rather than screened out through the planting. You're still allowed to see it, it's just through a veil. So there's an intrigue about discovering those steps, those 4 sets of steps going down into it, rather than it all being laid out in front of you in a formal way. And then this is the garden looking back, that same shot with the client standing there, showing you how that space has been integrated by the planting. So this is possible just to do something quite dramatic in 1 year, and it will change, of course, as it gets older and become more dramatic as things grow up. We've used a lot of perfumed plants in here because it's hedged, so it's going to be a very sensual space. There's a sense of quiet when you go down into here because the sound dims as you get below the height of the hedges. The sound of the bees and things beyond it are held, the sound of the wind is dimmed so that you hear the bees inside. And this is one very still piece of water, so this is very tranquil sort of heated space that you go down into, and which becomes a rather wonderful experience. So the space immediately beside it, this is the space we've just been in. So that was the moat that ran along the very simple westward looking garden. This is the sunken pool garden, and now alongside the house, this is the flower parterre, and this is a picture of the Jekyll's planting when it was taken for a series of articles which were written for Country Life. And we can see from this planting that she was using silvers and blues and whites. So we took the colour palette out of here, and some of the plants which she might have used, such as lavender, for instance, and asters, and then recomposed this planting. This is what we were faced with 4 or 5 rather motley-looking Fantin Latour roses. The beds had been taken out and replaced with lawns that the kids liked to play frisbee on, but we convinced the client that it was more important to play frisbee somewhere else. And to be able to plant this up with generosity so that once again we had this colour field, which would be a different colour field, which would be governed by these silvers and blues and violets and pinks, hot pinks, and dashes of white. We wanted this garden to be something that again would be continuous. We had this wonderful stone slab in the centre of the garden, and I took the stone slab out into the spaces by planting up a series of formal box shapes used informally throughout the space. So there was a sort of feeling of this stone table being taken out into this formal space. And then some cubes of miscanthus which were used as a contrast to the stillness of this box and the stillness and weightiness of this stone in something which would emerge out of the growth during the season. So you'd have these cubes of miscanthus which would come and go. Jekyll used miscanthus. It must have been so groundbreaking when she used it. And they were some of the plants which she had on her planting list. She used cranberry, which we used here. She used begonia. But I didn't use the horrible old begonia cordifolia. I used a begonia purpurascens called Helen Dillon form, which I know she would have loved if it had been around when she was gardening. And then this is the garden a year and a half later. Just seeing these box cubes emerging and the garden using this different colour field that allows your mood to change as you move through the space. And the weight of that wonderful stone slab in the middle. We think that this was definitely linked to his trips to India. And the client's mother, who's very interested in Asian religions, said, well, this is the pattern for, that very complex pattern for the sunken pool garden is actually a religious game. And this is, sure enough, we looked, and this was an altar which often appeared in those spaces where things were exhibited as part of the game. And this is the miscanthus just emerging here, just to show you the autumn incarnation of this garden, which we leave, much as Pete has done here in the garden, as something which is very good for frost and wildlife to inhabit during the winter. We've had to do a lot of hand-holding with the client to explain the importance of life and death in the garden, and the garden being on this cycle. And the garden being something which is not a continuous thing, which is a continuous thing but not a static thing, a thing which changes. And we've built change into the garden very effectively throughout the seasons, I think, with changes which allow these tidal movements of colour and the influence of one plant moving through quite wide spaces, leading you from one space to the next. So this is the next space is the old canal, which is definitely a Moorish influence, and it was always intended, we think, to be empty. The asters filled it in the old pictures, which were sort of 1950s and 60s, with lilies. It became something else during that period. And here you can see Jekyll's planting with the miscanthus and the planting in front of the Queen Anne part of the house. Very simple. And this is the canal, which is basically a reflective surface, looking the other way when we got hold of it. Very tired, landscaping exhausted, lawns not much to speak of. So we did a restoration on this space, which emptied the water body. All the water bodies were emptied, and then when we emptied it, we found this fantastic slate bottom, which we realised had never intended to be covered up. It was always supposed to be a glassy surface of water that you could see to the bottom. And we found that the water that moved through the garden from the raised white garden, which I showed you first with the fountain, then to a little cascade at the end of this piece, moved through from there to here, then down to the tank in the flower parterre, and then finally down into the sunken pool garden, was on a very intricate system of water gadgets which Lutyens had installed, and he had a 200,000 litre tank in the gardener's loft, the gardener's cottage in his loft. And the gardener, if he was showing somebody around, or the clients were showing, the inhabitants were showing people around the garden, had 20 minutes to show them once the water was turned on, because it hit one feature, moved through this, and you had to guide people through within that 20 minutes, because if you missed your timing, the water had finished by the time you got to the last feature. So one of the things we had to do was to find a way of putting this on a continuous cycle with special filters and cleaners to keep the water clean, but without using chemicals. A garden is gardened organically, which is very important to the client. And the water now works in a different system. The garden has now got a spare bedroom where this huge water tank was, and they're not having the worry of it crashing through into his living room below. And then this is something that we did, which was to make the planting much, much more simple here. So it just became about the watery surface, which reflects the building back down into it. So we installed cubes of yew, and then very simple panels of winter box, which smells wonderful at this time of year, and just allows this to be a reflective surface, which is a contrast to those very highly colourful spaces which are next door. The walled garden is a perfect acre, which Lutyens made and never did a design for. All that existed within it was a plunge pool in the centre, for a dipping pool for watering. And we had this wonderful situation with the client saying, here you are not manacled by Lutyens within the ornamental gardens. We give you free rein to do whatever you would like. Obviously you've got to prove to us that it's going to be what we want. A perfect acre is a lot of space to be growing it's a big productive space, and they're a family of 5. They didn't want to be overwhelmed with a glut of vegetables and fruits, so we decided to divide it into a space which provided fruits and flowers, cut flowers, herbs and vegetables, and a space for growing things to be going back into the garden for the rest of the garden. So this was the garden when we took it over. It had been used by a nurseryman before. This is what happened when the nurseryman moved out. So very, very simply gardened with the raised pool in the centre. And we looked at really creating a garden which looked at this idea of history. We were at a critical point of making the garden last for another 100 years. This was our commission. And making what had come before us tie into that new vision for the next 100 years. So we're sort of in this middle point, and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to treat it like a warp and a weft, like a textile of past, present and future? So what we did was look at dividing it into spaces with beds that overlapped, creating this idea of warp and weft, which was a nice little metaphor for us to help create a series of spaces which we then were able to divide into a lavender field, a rose garden, a small herb garden, cutting beds around the outside, a vegetable garden here, fruit along this hot sunny wall, and then an asparagus and wildflower garden for cutting flowers. So this is the garden going in. The client had a helicopter that he went to and fro from work in, and one day he said, I'd like you to come up and see the garden from above. Looks fantastic. So he took me on a whirlwind tour, which lasted 20 minutes, very hair-raising tour. I can't remember because I was taking so many photographs, and we went on a big spin around, and it was fascinating seeing the garden from above, which of course you never get a chance to do. And you can see all the shapes going in here, and this is my assistant Heidi who worked on the garden. We had to drop the level by 18 inches in the garden because over the years it had raised through all the organic matter that had gone into it, so all this material had to be taken out and then brought back in again. And these are a series of samples which we put in to look at this idea of modern materials and old materials. So this is a local gravel, 3 local materials which we were looking at, and then crushed concrete. So we reused all the old concrete which was in the old car parks as a crushed material, as a modern material to look at this idea of warp and weft. and look at the idea of the beds not only are the beds overlapping in terms of colour and texture, but the paths also doing that. And we always go through a series of providing a client with samples so they can see what they're going to have. Always thinking about keeping any material palette down to a maximum of 4 in any one space. These are pergolas that went up to provide us with shade. This is 2 degrees warmer than the garden outside. It's hot inside this garden. The wind is diminished by the tall walls. And these pergolas and arbours became a central feature within the space. These are what we call the pear squares. Again, drawing that idea of the squares in the garden, those enclosed rooms, providing you these rooms that you can enter within this whole acre to change the scale. This one is actually a rose square because it sits within the rose garden, but there are 2 more which we call pear squares. This is a pergola which is planted with grapes. This is the lavender field 1 year later with strips of centaureas and agapanthus running through, moving up to look at a little room in the corner which we call the herb drying room, and a rose garden. We took all the roses except species roses out of the ornamental gardens because they're a problem in terms of health. We put the roses back into this garden. They're all gardened organically, but we used the David Austin modern English roses, which are look like old-fashioned roses but have the health of a modern rose. And everything here is gardened organically, so no chemicals used. And the idea is that there is always going to be something that the clients can put on their bedside table, whatever the day in the year. So the hot walls are covered in winter sweet for this time of year, clematis for the summer, and the garden is filled with flowers that can be taken down to the house. These are simple oak benches which were beautifully made by a wonderful company who did this beautiful Japanese jointing for us. And they also worked on these pergolas to provide us with these fruit enclosures. And this is the pergola with blueberries growing in pots and a shaded space underneath and the vines growing up and that dipping pool being the place where we now have the water lilies. And then I wanted to take the scale up because an acre is a big space if it's flat. So we created these huge hop poles and used a man who made these wonderful wigwams for us. He was actually called Mick Sticks. And this guy made these terrific, tall, 5.5 metre series of wigwams for us, which we've got parsley-leaved blackberries going up some, and hops going up others, and pumpkins. This is the vegetable garden. This is the asparagus beds with pictorial meadow wildflower mixes going through them. And you can see how the scale of those hop poles really helps. These are the cutting borders with the clematis wall behind for the annuals. And these are the cutting borders with the Chimonanthus wintersweet wall with a field of tulips for the spring. We're able to put in about 5,000 tulips a year here because the client loves them, and it's just a wonderful thing to be. It's a very unusual project in terms of how much the client's prepared to sink in the garden as well. They're very committed to it, and the beauty of having a client that comes to a property that is dilapidated like this and is prepared to put money into it is that it is something which is preserved for the next future generation. So it's been a real privilege to be part of somebody's vision for the future. And then this is looking finally at the weak chin, which was where we think Latins had exhausted the clients, and Chico had done those little sketches. So we made a place called the Wind Garden, which is super simple, a series of squares again. The wind races across from the west and is only held back by the hedges. But we've used it and harnessed it with a series of simple grass plantings with corners, coloured stem corners, which pick up on the colour of the roofs in the winter and then allow us these views out, taking that colour from the heat of the roofs out into the landscape beyond. And this is us stepping out over a simple bridge which has seats on either side, back over the moat into the landscape with the meadows newly established, and that outward garden now looking in to the inward-looking garden, which has this second new chapter alongside it, and a new 100 years worth of thinking, which we hope will furnish it well for the future. So it's been a marvellous project to work on. I just wanted to go into my second project here, which is the Millennium Forest in Hokkaido, a completely different project. Hokkaido is the northernmost island in Japan, and I was approached by the client, who is a newspaper magnate, to work on a site which at that point was 250 hectares in the year 2000. And I was seduced by his landscape architect, Mr. Takano, who's a wonderful landscape architect who works mostly with children's spaces. He'd done the first master plan, by a series of wonderful journeys that he took me out on over a series of 3 or 4 days, which culminated in us ending up sitting in a hot spring on the side of a mountain in a woodland just before the moon came up in minus 25 degrees, naked, with a tin of Sapporo beer. And as the moon came up after 3 days of wonderful journeys and trips in hot air balloons to see the landscape and things, he said to me, as the moon came up over the mountain, "Would you like to work on the project?" And I couldn't refuse. And I've been working there ever since. So we, DPS, were asked to provide a master plan which looked at a series of spaces which allowed Japanese people to be part of landscape. If you think about landscape gardens in Japan, they are very carefully constructed, and they are 2 degrees at least removed from natural landscape. Although they're inspired by landscape, they are often the garden designers are looking at writers and artists who are painting landscape. So they're one removed from the real thing. And the Japanese garden is something that is so highly organized and so immaculately maintained that really, and the Japanese culture has become so urbanized. If you go to Japan, there are these ribbons of development which are all connected by railways or roads, and the landscape is one thing with farmland and forest where you can't get up into the hills, and then living an urban life is another. It's not like us, the way we kind of are able to move much more easily between the two. So the idea about the ecological forests that we were creating here was allowing people this opportunity to get into landscape and get their feet dirty. Mr. Hayashi, who was a newspaper magnate, bought more and more land with the view that this business, which it had to be to make it function, was going to be carbon neutral. He's now got 400 hectares, and the mountainside which he's bought, which is now much bigger in this direction, you can see why he's done this, because the farmland has started to erode all the wildness, and what he's doing is reclaiming this and allowing people to be part of that. So our master plan looked at creating a series of spaces which allowed people to get out of their vehicles, move through forest very gently, and find themselves in a space which might be much wilder than they'd ever been into, through being seduced by us, the landscape designers, into something that they felt comfortable in. So the spaces we made were really very much inspired by the environment which was surrounding us. And Takano had already started looking at how the forest might be manipulated. What had happened when the Americans had gone in? This island has only been colonized for about 120 years. The Americans went in and stripped the forest for as far as they could up the hills of good oak, and it was taken out. And what happened was the secondary forest regenerated, and birch came in with a creeping bamboo called sasa, which erased the forest floor as it rampaged across in the open new conditions that had been established. And what Takano found was that if you started to trim the sasa back, the bamboo, and you did it for 4 or 5 years, the seed bank in the ground from those hundreds and thousands of years beforehand simply was able to regenerate. if you allowed the light to come to the floor. And what happened was you got this amazing forest floor. And here you can see an image of the summer incarnation of this, with the stream running through, this silvery stream. I want you to remember this stream because these slip through these sort of mercury lines that move through this wonderful green in the forest. And what you have as you move through these forests, which are the first things you go through on these duckboards, you can just see one here in the foreground, allowing you to pass over it without touching it, is a series of changing, evolving landscapes, really, or versions of the same landscape as the season moves through. First you have trilliums and wild anemones and scented-leafed primulas, and then you have erythroniums, and then you have cardiocrinums, the giant tall scented lilies that move up with huge arizemas, these exotic, wonderful dark black flowered arizemas. A magical woodland which is filled with magical things, and this became a huge inspiration for me. And what happens when you get to the edge of that woodland is that you hit the farmland, where the farmland has simply come up to the edge of the woodland, where the farmers couldn't go any further. And there was this big open field. There was a restaurant which had already been put in by the owner. And the open field was somewhere where people would just stop. They'd sit in the restaurant, not want to go any further, because this 5 hectares of land between them and the mountains was somewhere that was indefinable in terms of scale. And what I did was an exercise in looking at the range of mountains and thinking about how we could manipulate this piece of ground with a land form that allowed the mountains to come into a series of artificial foothills, which would make the space definable in terms of scale. So this is looking down from the mountains. This is the forest we've just been through, which with that magical forest. This is the restaurant. This is this 5 hectares of land in front of it. And the series of landforms I created were a series of rises and troughs that allowed you to move through the space and create a new horizon line in front of you. So looking outwards from that restaurant towards the mountains, you had something that wasn't flat, that was then definable in front of you. So this is, we did an exercise where we made a 1:20 scale model, which is about half the size of this room, with little tiny Japanese rakes and sand, with Mr. Takano, who was the project manager. And then we went ahead with 3 or 4 huge bulldozers and made these landforms, which you can see here are echoing the shapes of the mountains in the background. And these are huge. Some of these drops are up to 5 or 6 meter runs in some places. And what was fascinating about this, and you can see this landform now having taken shape, was we really didn't know what was going to happen with this space until we made it. I had no idea that the convex shapes would mean that when you went down into the troughs, you had a wide, broad soundscape that allowed you to hear the forest behind you and the sound to either side. And when you went into the convex shapes, they brought the sound of the mountain into that shape, which was a completely different acoustic experience. I had no idea that this was going to happen. So you went into a space which became sensually enriched through being changed in terms of its contours. What happened inside those concave shapes as well is that they magnified the mountains. Somehow they brought the mountains into your view because they contained it, because you had this sense of the shape behind you, framing you, holding you like a bowl. So it was completely fascinating, and thank goodness Mr. Hayashi, our client, for being brave enough to say yes when I put this proposal to him, because it takes somebody like this with a vision as big as this to be behind us as landscape designers to do something as brave as this with the space. Mr. Hayashi's vision to me was that this landscape should be sustainable for 1,000 years. This is kind of a crazy idea, because what does that actually mean? And this is the landscape looking out to the mountains. So this is us sitting in the restaurant with those new landforms in front of you rolling out. And what was brilliant about this, and it really worked, was that when families went here, where they sat and sort of clustered around the buildings previously. When these landforms were put in, the kids ran to the end of the landforms and promptly disappeared. Ran over the edge, slipped down the slope, had a wonderful time out of the sight of their families. And the families then thought, well, where have they gone? You know, and they went to the edge, and you see the families disappearing. Then you see the kids running up over the next one and then disappearing, and then the parents going after them. And then they found themselves on the edge of the landscape, on a woodland trail, which was our intention, where there was mud and dirt underfoot and art installations in the woodlands to take them out further, where they might well see bears and wild horses in the forests, and into a place that had felt secure and had allowed them to be part of that nature and part of that bigger vision, which then allowed them once again to look at what was right in front of them and think about the importance of nature being something which should be preserved and not just eaten into for the sake of man using it as a resource. So we were charged with this idea of, well, how do we communicate this idea of something being sustainable for 1,000 years when we can only sustain it for as long as one generation is prepared to put money and resources into it? And we thought, well, if we can create this place where people are inspired by nature, to then inspire their children, who quite obviously enjoy it, who then will inspire their children in turn, surely we can set up this cycle where people will start to love this piece of land and want to protect it. So we started a campaign of collecting seeds, which the kids can grow and then put wildflowers back into the meadows. We started a campaign of them collecting tree seeds so they can then grow the seeds in their primary schools and grow them when they went up into the next school and then go back and plant them as trees and then go back with their own children and look at that stand of trees which they put in themselves. And then we thought, well, we need to create something here as well for gardeners, or people who love gardens, who are a whole other untapped audience, you know, which Hauser and Wirth have tapped into very effectively here by having the wonderful peat garden in the back here. There's a whole audience of people who are garden lovers, people who know how to look at things, who know how to make that connection between nature and art, who may not be coming to this place because it's simply a space to go into the wild. There are a whole series of people who might just come and look at this place just for the art which is in the landscape. So we wanted to create a space which was somewhere between the two. So we looked at creating a flower garden which was using the inspiration of that wonderful forest floor with its evolution of one layer moving over the next over the course of a season to provide you with this changing colour palette and changing mood. And decided that we'd use the woodland floor as inspiration in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the naturalism of that, but combine the Japanese natives, many of which we grow, like Lilium auratum, the Japanese golden ray lily of Japan, that grows in the forests. The cardiocrinums, the trilliums, all those things which they were having right underneath their feet and maybe were very used to. By combining those with Western style plants, we got people to look at their own plants in a different way because you put things out of context together and suddenly people are looking at things in a new way. So our plan was to make a perennial garden here, which you can see looking down on here, another 5 hectares, planted out with 35,000 perennials, probably a similar sized space to the garden out the back here. With the plants going in June. This is the planting plans, showing this walkway which moves through, which reflects that silvery mercurial slip of water which moves through in those wonderful little arteries in the forests, and creates a sort of metaphorical waterway through this space, dividing an imaginary damp space which has the woodland edge from a much drier, lighter space above it. And then these are, I won't go into how we did it now, but they're planting mixes which are planted in a completely free-form way. So we chose 5 or 6 plants for each of these mixes and then put them in a ratio which meant that we were guessing how the most vigorous thing would react with the least vigorous thing. So the The most vigorous thing was in the lowest percentages, the least vigorous thing was in the highest percentages, and we chose tall things and short things and mid-sized things and things for early in the season, things for late, so that we would choose plants which were working with each other like they do in the woodland. This is the garden in June, the end of July, 1 month after it was planted. And 1 year after that, with the walkway moving through it, and you can see here the edge of the forest coming down into this cool glade of planting, and then the meadow garden above it. So this is the glade with the woodlandy mixers, Hakanakloa, macra, Japanese grass, Aralia growing wild in the forests. I just brought it out and used it as an ornamental here. The gardeners were worried that the Japanese people would eat the Aralia because it's a great, wonderful thing that they use for tempura, the tips. I said, no, they won't do that. Because it's in a garden setting, and sure enough, because it was in a garden setting, nobody ventured in to eat the tips. But we use Japanese things alongside Western-style plants. So this is an American Persicaria. These are the golden-rayed lilies of Japan. This is Filipendula kamchatka, which is our meadow sweet, an uber-sized meadow sweet with leaves that big and 7 foot tall. And then this is that mix that you can see spilling around it, which is a cool, shimmery green and white mix. I changed the colour fields as we moved through the space. I'm a great believer in colour allowing you to change your mood and drawing you. It has the power to draw you and change you, and to move you through spaces. So as you move up through the gardens, the colour field changes, and you have these little walkways which move through it like little animal tracks, allowing you this very close interaction with this palette of plants which over the season changes, so that any 2 weeks, any 1 week is not the same from the next. And what we found here, this is the wonderful Midori, the head gardener, who I could not do this without. She's an unsung hero. What we found was that because these Western-style plants were being used alongside the British natives, was that the pollen counts just went right up. And what happened was that the ecology just ballooned. And Midori would send me, still does, these wonderful little haikus where she just sends me a very short little introduction saying, today the air is very still. You know, it would always start with something giving you a sense of place. And then so this one started with, today people are screaming. And then I went on, I thought, well, what has happened in the garden? You know, and they were screaming because the swallowtail butterflies had discovered these wonderful cephalarias in the back here. And because the cephalarias were growing 7 or 8 feet tall, and there were so many of them, and so many other nectar-rich things around them, there was this huge kind of, I don't know, what is a flock of butterflies? What would it be? A myriad, maybe, of butterflies. And you walked into the cephalarias, and they took off and made this incredible sound with all these wings beating amongst the flowers. It was absolutely magical. So it created, once again, a sensual space, a place which has allowed people to look at their own native flora in a different way because it's combined with Western-style plants alongside it. And a completely different way of gardening, which is very alien from that Japanese controlled way of gardening things. The final project, because I am running out of time, is the Garden Bridge. And this is a project which was dreamed up by the visionary Joanna, I've had a horrible blank. Lumley. Joanna Lumley. It's because I'm on first name terms now, which is one of the huge bonuses, of course, of doing this project, because she is a very inspired and very wonderful and clear-thinking person who came up with this idea of a bridge over the Thames when Diana Spencer died, and it was presented to the government and lost momentum, and she had it on the back boiler and she wanted to do it, and she talked to Thomas Heatherwick about it. And after the excitement of the Olympics, there was this buoyant feeling which Thomas was able to then go back to the government with and say, look, we've got this wonderful idea. Why don't we try and make a bridge across the Thames that is actually a garden bridge? It's a kind of fantasy idea because he is a great believer in the integration of landscape and building, and landscape being space for people, working for people. And this is an image of Waterloo Bridge, which is the bridge which has perhaps the best views in the whole of London, admittedly at 5 o'clock on Christmas morning. But it is paths which are dominated by traffic and hostile. It's an 8-minute walk across the Thames. It's windy, it's cold, admittedly. You might not want to stop here. But what the idea of the bridge will do is it will be the slowest route across the Thames, Joanna's words. And it will be a place which people will want to go to see London reframed through a garden, to see horticulture at a point of excellence in the very centre of the city. And this is the view from Waterloo Bridge with a projected view of all those new buildings which are rising up. And the bridge will come across here from London Weekend Television to Temple Station on the other side. And what the bridge aims to do is to create this link. This is Waterloo Bridge, that's Blackfriars Bridge, and it aims to make a link through from Temple Station through this way for pedestrians to link the Aldwych, which is currently a very strange space on the edge of another very wonderful part of London, Covent Garden here. So I don't know if any of you have ever walked down through here. It's sort of like a no man's land. And then you get down to here and you've got all this tremendous hubbub, of course, of the very successful South Bank. So this is a model of the bridge in Thomas's offices. He's a great believer in modelling and model making, totally three-dimensional person, a very inspiring person to work with. And it's a fantastic team. We've got Arup on board, who are wonderful engineers, driving the project fiercely and furiously because it's got to move fast. And what we did as an exercise in trying to contextualise the garden was to look at how the history of this part of London could influence us, much as the warp and the weft helped us create a space within the walled garden at Folly Farm. I wanted to see how London had been, and having lived in South London for 20 years, I've lived in Vauxhall and Peckham, and now I'm living in Waterloo. I know this part of town very well, and I do know from reading Pepys's diaries that it was only very recently that this was all meadow, water meadow and marshland, and then I lived in a house down in Peckham, down here somewhere, that was, until very recently, willow beds and then nurseries. We do know that there was a history of gardens in Vauxhall with the pleasure gardens. And then we do know, of course, that this is the old city with a much longer history. So what we did was to look at the South Bank as being this young, pioneering space, which has recently been made from reclaimed lands. Look at the street names there, the Cut, Lower Marsh, Upper Marsh. There were market gardens here. There was William Curtis's Botanic Garden. There were theatres, public entertainment, public parks and pleasure gardens. It was somewhere that was on the wild side. It was somewhere that was maybe a little risque to go for a long time. And what we did was to find that, there had actually been a whole life of garden down here with William Curtis, who then went on to set up the Chelsea Physic Garden. With a wonderful botanic garden here on the South Bank. And then the North Bank, much, much older. The Knights Templar set up a garden at the Inns of Court in the 12th century. So there were cultivated ornamental gardens here on this piece of land. This is probably where Temple Station's about here. from that period. So the Knights Templars were bringing back olives and roses and figs and all those things way back in the medieval period. And the RHS had their first show gardens here that preceded the Chelsea Showgrounds. So this had this wonderful, rich history of horticulture as well. So I looked at, this is one of my first sketches. We knew that we had 2 depths of soil over the 2 feet on the bridge that went down to 2 meters. We knew that we had a thin depth of soil here and thinner depths of soil at either side. The brief to us was that they wanted, Thomas wanted this profile where you would have these clusters of trees to allow you to reframe views of St. Paul's through 2 copses. And that then gave me the opportunity to provide 5 chapters, which then became Pioneer on the south, a wild glade which was a cross between Pioneer and something more ornamental. What we then called the Scarp, which helped us look at how we might plant it, looking at a windswept, thin ground, space with big views out and open, down into an ornamental glade, which starts to get the influence of a more ornamental North Shore and an older part of London. So looking at the Pioneer, we looked at trees which might regenerate very quickly on newly reclaimed ground, things which might be coppiced. We wanted to look at things which maybe have been used on the South Bank very recently, like willows for basket making. We wanted people to get used to the idea of this being a space which is in flux. It's a garden which is not going to be like a London park, kind of preserved in some sort of aspic. It's a space which is dynamic. It's a properly gardened garden, which will be providing something of interest and change on every single day of the year. You go on there one year, it will be different from the next. We want to build in that idea that this is a space which will be changing. So the coppice helps us instill that idea in people's minds that a garden is something which is evolving. This is the palette looking at the naturalistic style that I'm so fond of, being an opportunity to bring in ecologically viable and rich species, combining ornamentals with predominantly things which have colonized this country, things which William Curtis was introducing early, things which would have been moving up and down the Thames, with beginnings of ornamental plants alongside them. This is the wild glade beyond it, where the first trees start to appear. And in the center, we have crossing points through a 12-meter wide glade here. These are about 3 or 4 meters wide, these edge parts. 3.5-meter wide paths, and then these cross paths which allow you to enter the glades. The cross paths, of course, also allow us to reframe views. So it's an exercise in, this is an image actually from the Millennium Forest, which shows how that wild glade might feel using herbs. This is Valeriana officinalis alongside, ornamental plants and introductions and native plants alongside that. In a naturalistic way, which will allow you to see through the planting to the cityscape beyond it. This is looking into the wild glade, types of plants which we might be using. And then the Scarp, looking to environments. I'm a great lover of looking to landscape for the inspiration, and this was an image which sort of captured our imagination. Imagine what it must be like to stand in the middle of the river and look east or look west down this sweep and the bend of the river with a whole cityscape revealed to you, and perhaps the windiest place on the river walk. It was your place where you open out into the widest views so that you've been in the enclosed, magical, dappled spaces of the glades, going into and out onto this open expanse where we've got plants that harness the wind, angels' fishing rods. We're using river birch, by the way. We're using things that will harness the wind in their foliage, like Thamnocortus insignis, a wonderful South African sedge, grasses to pick up that breeze as well. going down into the ornamental glade that starts to see more ornamental plants used alongside fewer natives. Again, another picture from the Millennium Forest, showing how the colour will heat up and how it will become much more ornamental in feel, and will start to prepare us for going into a much more built up, a much older part of the city where you might expect to see something that's maybe more cultivated. When I've been describing this to people, one of the planning responses was that the people on the South Bank were feeling very left out in terms of their culture on the bridge, because they were feeling that the wild and woolly on the south side is not as sophisticated as the ornamental, cultivated culture on the north. And I realised I've got to get my words right, because I think the south side is far more interesting, because you've got that wonderful kind of much more in flux balance happening with the coppices and things. And this is much more stable, it's much more sedate in a way. But we've got to word it carefully, because people are always going to have strong opinions about what they're going to have to live with that's close to them. As you know, the bridge has already created fierce debates about whether or not it should even be there. And then stepping down through the leafy glade to Temple Gardens, which is the small garden on the outside. And the plants becoming much cooler and more calmer, winter sweets again. The views being terribly important, we've had to think about how the garden can reframe your experience of London, how at certain points we want to be able to see through from side to side so that you can see St Paul's from Waterloo Bridge, and then you can see back to the Houses of Parliament from Blackfriars Bridge. And then how you get more intimate spaces created by held spaces within. We've had to think about security issues. What happens with people that might feel that there could be somebody lurking in the bushes? Unsavoury behaviour, which is immediately kind of eased by raising the canopy slightly. We're only using multi-stem trees because wind is going to be our ally in a way, because it will create movement on the bridge, but can also be a problem in terms of being not good for trees that are single-stemmed. So it plays into my hands very nicely because I'm interested in the naturalistic style, so the multi-stems are going to be used. This is a visualization looking at how the reframing of the trees will maybe look after the first 10 years, and one of the central spaces. And this is my exercise at the moment, which is a mind-bending exercise of putting the planting plans together, which is really quite a frightening thing to do because we've got so many things to consider. There are all these infrastructures which are within the bridge to keep it holding up, beams and subterranean water holding structures and irrigation and lighting, and we've got to make sure that the plants are suitable for their environment and that the bridge is going to work on day 1 in terms of the planting, it's going to work in year 10, it's going to be also viable after 120 years. So my planting, here I am sitting feeling rather alone, and these are the planting plans starting to evolve. I bead all my planting plans so I know where every plant goes. All the perennials are put in at 30 centimetre spacings, but I layer the plantings using series of basically overlays. So I start with the trees on the lower layers, and then I put a layer of tracing paper over it, and then I put the shrubs on, then I put another layer of tracing paper on, and I put the groups of perennials in. So here I am grouping the perennials in combinations which I think will work together in that situation. And then the final layer is the bulb layer. So we're currently going to tender. This is Thomas, again, with his beautiful trees that have been modelled. This is trees after 25 years, to show people what they might look like. 15-metre limit on trees, by the way. We've got to make the trees stop growing at 15 metres. So I've also got to think about what is actually going. How do trees respond in a windy environment where the soil is thin, etc., etc., etc.? There's a lot to think about. And these are the trees on day 1, because we're not able to put in large trees to start with. They're only 3 to 5 metres tall for the wind issues. And then this is the image of the bridge as it will be with the new skyline. And probably, I would think, year 5, with a prospect. For us, it's terribly, terribly exciting. For me, it's a 10-minute walk from my studio in Waterloo. So I will be going every day. I walk my dog on the beach, just here on the South Bank every night, and look up into this space in the air and imagine this thing sailing over me. We're beginning to generate feelings which are weighted very much in both directions. But remember that St. Paul's was seen as being a vanity piece when it was proposed, that people really didn't want the London Eye, and they love it now. And we are very good in this country at being innovators, but we're extremely good as well at saying yes, but. So we're now at that yes, but stage, and having to get as much good feeling as possible as we can. I have just a handful of slides. I know I've run over time. I don't know whether people want 5 more minutes to show where I am now. And I promise I won't leave for more than 5 minutes, because I made the move. Thank you. Please feel free to leave if you want, but I promise I won't run on. I left Peckham after living there for 13 years with my partner Hugh, having gardened every single inch of my garden, to a point where I was starting to feel claustrophobic again and root-bound, as you do, as gardeners do. And moved to Bath, near Bath, a hillside. The property is actually called Hillside, and 20 acres of land. My best friend Jane lives on the other side, and I'd been to a book signing, my book Spirit, 5 years ago now, one autumn, and I'd walked the land with her and said, on her farm, and said, if anything ever comes up in the area, will you let me know? And then in January, the old man who lived here, who'd been born in the house and then died on his tractor in the barn, one very cold December. The property hadn't gone on the market, but Donald, Jane's husband, said, why don't you get Hugh and Dan to come and have a look? And we walked down the hill, through the stream, up this steep hill, looked around the house in 15 minutes because it's quite small. And as we were walking down the hill, we said, how are we going to do it? Not how can we do it or anything like that. It was just totally, we didn't even need to talk about it. And it's been the best thing we've ever done, because it's offered me what I love most, is this connection with nature, and to be part of something rather than to be dominating something entirely. It's a completely different thing to maintaining a garden with walls and boundaries that you are in control of in every direction. I have to be subservient to the greater majority of this 20 acres and to steer it very gently, and it's about this dialogue and this very gentle steer that I'm most interested in at the moment. So I'm learning to manipulate the spaces, to relax the land. The farmer the land used to be market gardens for Bath, which were further down the valley until the 1950s. So it's fantastic growing land, south-facing, everything grows like stink. I've never seen anything grow as robustly as it grows here. And then you sweep down to the ground on the lower level where there's streams. And the previous farmer, Norman, who'd lived there before, had beef cattle. He beefed every single inch out of that piece of ground. And the stream he took a barbed wire fence right up to the very edge, and he flailed all the trees back so there was no grass, he called it grub, that was shaded by anything. And what I've done is I've relaxed everything. And we've now got a relationship with 2 farmers who put sheep on the land in the winter. And I'm then taking a series of spaces back for myself. I've planted a blossom wood. I've allowed this environment along the stream to spread back into the field. I'm starting to let the ditch recolonize the damp ground to either side of it. And this is me in a kind of ecstasy, looking at the weeds in this ditch, providing me with everything that I've ever wanted to be part of. And for me, what I am planning is 3 very simple crossings across this ditch. It's quite a simple quite a steep little ravine with a constantly running brook at the bottom of it, leading down to the stream at the bottom. I'm going to make these very beautiful, very simple Japanese-style zigzag bridges which just cross, allowing me to go from one side to the other, from one side to the other, switch backwards and forwards, so I can have a walk along the brook that then allows me to move, perhaps if I want to, into the field beyond it where we've got an old orchard and where we're just putting these fields which have been intensively grazed, these pasture fields, back down to meadow. So I'm learning about the art of oversowing the meadows with wildflower seed and using yellow rattle to allow the wildflower seed to be part of the meadows. And this is 3 years in, we're 4 years there now, after overseeding with a wildflower meadow mix. So this is what's possible in 3 years. And I'm now getting a hay crop off here and then putting sheep back. But for me, it's just the most extraordinary thing to be part of something which is evolving back in the right direction again. And I will know I've succeeded when I get orchids back onto this land again. They're on the hill opposite. I'm very lucky to have Emmersgate Seeds, which are wildflower producers, opposite me on the field, so I walk up into their land. They're great friends of mine. I've got free advice whenever I want it. And this palette, this blank canvas, where I have to match what I can do to how far I can go out into the landscape in terms of ornamental gardening. And this is me planting my orchard in 2011, the first January that we were there. And the orchard 4 years later. I've already got too many plums to harvest. I'm thinking of making a relationship with a good restaurant near me, so they can come and pick as much as they want for the odd free meal, which seems like a good way to do things to barter. I've got a nuttery down by the stream. I've got plums, mirabelles, damsons here, pears, cooking apples, eating apples, all southwestern varieties from a very good nursery called Thornhays. I carved out a small piece of ground where there would have been these market gardens once, and fenced it to keep the animals out, and started a productive garden, which was my first move, and a whole trial of things to see what was going to be viable there. I took 2 carloads only from my garden in Peckham of plants, and I've probably only got 6 or 7 things that I really want there now from my previous London garden, because things just don't feel right in this place. I've had to find a new palette. So this is about finding the palette, seeing what works, and what works on my windy hillside that is also bathed in sunshine and riddled with springs that run through the land. So I have to find the dry bits and the wet bits, and it's a process of discovery. And I've had to re-landscape the ground as well, because we had, I think, probably 12 square feet of flat ground on the whole entire site. And you realise when you're walking at that sort of angle, wherever you are, there's a thing called Swainswick Hip in our valley, which is all the old people suffer from walking on this slope. So I've landscaped a flat space around the old barn. I've come to love these dishevelled barns, which are everything's held together with baler twine and wire. It's all asbestos and tin. It's what you might imagine to be ugly on day one. And then very quickly you get into this slightly buggered aesthetic. I've got into breeze block, so I'm making all my new walls with breeze block, using a mortar, lime mortar, to make them look older. I'm going to use reclaimed tin. I'm not afraid of it. I'm using recycled concrete, steel for the new vegetable garden. So this is my new vegetable garden, which I've just started last autumn. That will be planted up, and the garden on the other side will then become what will be a limited experimental flower garden, which takes in the idea of being able to work with plants in an experimental way, in a naturalistic way, but for me to be able to garden this garden and not to garden too much, and for the landscape to be the thing which I step into to get my inspiration for my work. And it is my soul food, It's the place which I love more than anywhere else and makes me very happy to travel back from wherever I am in the world. These extraordinary places that clients invite me to go to that they've spent whole lifetimes often finding. I come back here and think, yes, but this is my own piece of paradise. So thank you very much for letting me overrun.
Just regards to the Millennium Forest, you mentioned when you did the plantings that you chose four or six for each zone.
Yeah.
And then you kind of implied that it was sort of you did sort of random dispersals. Is that what you did?
Yes. Did everybody hear the question? Do you want me to repeat it?
So, was there a specific planting placement plan?
Yes.
Or did you have quantity and scatter?
Well, I've kind of been evolving a system over years that allows me to emulate what happens in nature. So if you look into any meadow, for instance, there might be, in this country, a limited number of species, say 25 different species in a square metre. And those things have evolved over time to live with each other. So you get a balance of a certain number of one thing alongside a certain number of another. And that will, of course, change throughout a meadow, depending on whether it's a damp patch or a dry patch or a shady patch or whatever. But you sort of look at the mean average of what might appear in that piece of ground. And then if you're then interpreting that study, which is an ecological study, really, with ornamental plants, you then have to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to choose a more limited number of things because I can't put 25 things into 1 square metre. I could try, and I might be able to do it one day when I become really skilled at it. But for now, I'm not, as skilled as I need to be. That's what the evolution's all about. I'm digressing already, but you choose things which you hope are going to be compatible together. So to make it simple, I chose 5 or 6 things. And I chose things which would be essentially ground covers, things which would be a mid-height thing, and then emergence, which are the tall things which come up above that. And then I allowed myself a couple of treats, which could be emergence or isolated things that might just appear as one-offs. And then I put those things into a series of percentages. So I worked out, for instance, that I'd have 25 plants per square metre. And then I would put the percentages alongside those. So the emergence might be 3 plants per square metre. The crown covers might be 12. The treats might be another 3. So I was then having to make those educated guesses as to what how those things might work together. This gets quite complicated. And then I put a strand of those plants. I put them in like a little textile, where I interspersed those numbers in a random way in a long column like that, which looked like a strand of DNA. And then we just got a computer system which allowed that strand of DNA just to be made into a pattern. So the computer just went, and it made it into a pattern, which meant that you then got something which was completely random. And we gave this to the Japanese that we were working with as a tool which didn't need language. It was a system. And one of the things that could go seriously wrong with this is that you could get language issues. But if it was a system, the Japanese love systems. And actually, we're quite good at them too. So we made it into a textile that then was laid down onto the ground. And then it's all completely dependent on Midori, the wonderful Midori, being able to steer it. And I made a couple of absolute corkers with those mixes. So we had 18 mixes in total. And I think one mix I put a plant I'd seen in the meadows out there, wild, a Thamopsis, a wild Thamopsis, which is like a yellow lupin. And when it grows in the meadows in Japan, it's competing alongside wild miscanthus. And if you think about how thuggish those grasses are, so there was one little bit of, Thamopsis like this. So I thought, okay, well, the Thamopsis can probably go in at a 5% mix. And Midori sent me an image 1 year after planting of one plant which she'd painstakingly removed, which was 3 meters across. It was an artwork. She dug the whole thing up. You can just imagine them in Japan, can't you, picking every root out and keeping it entire, and then she photographed it from above. She said, this is one plant, which had gone 3 meters. because it didn't have the competition from the other species, which allowed it to be part of. And if you think about the way that a creeping thistle, for instance, is not a problem in a meadow, but if you put a creeping thistle into a garden, it just rampages because it doesn't have that ecology below the ground to keep it in check. So what that mix does, it allows us to hopefully get things which are going to be in balance with each other. And over the years, the last 10 years of gardening the garden with Midori, we've honed the mixes now. So I need to redo the percentages, but they're now working. We've taken out a couple of things which don't work. We've introduced things which do. We've also got to work with an environment which goes down to minus 25 degrees in the winter and sits underneath the snow between middle of October to the end of April. So it's very different from gardening here, where everything then is coming together as well, which is partly why we got those amazing butterfly myriads, because everything was concertinaed into a shorter summer. A very long answer, I'm sorry.
Let's just take another couple of questions.
Dan, back in the Millennium Forest, with the Sasa, did you manage to eradicate, or did it come back? I just can't believe knowing what Sasa's like.
Yes, it's a thug.
Did it work?
That's another example of something that got out of control because the balance was readjusted, you see. So it goes back to this whole thing of understanding the balance. And what we did was thin the forest enough because the new regenerated forest was very dense. So we thinned it to allow a certain amount of light through to the forest floor, which was guesswork. And then by trimming it repeatedly, the first year you got, because the season's very short there, I'm not sure it would work here, Annie, but because the season's short, if you trim it in the autumn, hasn't got a head start in the spring because it's got no leaves on it. So it then has to grow, and then it has to come into leaf, and it's probably July by the time it's come into leaf, and then it's only got July and August, and then September the temperature's cooling again. So it's got a very short window with things like deer coming in and eating the lovely new fresh growth, and bears. And then you do it again the next year and it diminishes again. And then you do it again, it diminishes again. All the time it's opening up holes underneath for the seeds in the seed bank to start getting a hold, which in turn then start to diminish its impact because it's not the top dog anymore. And it would work here, but I think you'd have to trim it twice a year. And you'd have to trim it while it was still soft and succulent. And I think you would get on top of it, and it would probably take you twice as long. But after 5 years of trimming, 3 years on the trot, and then I think they gave it a year off, and then another year. After 5 years, it was diminished enough for the forest floor to come through. And what they then do is go in every other year, and so they have a cycle where they go around the forest and do that.
So all that lovely herbaceous growth that's coming up, does that happen after 5 years, or is it happening at the same time?
It starts happening straight away. So you get the pioneer species coming in first. Which were Trolleus, I think, and but things like the trilliums, which take up to 10 years to flower. They're just tiny little seedlings which just sit there and sulk for a little bit before they get themselves going. But we've got skunk cabbages now. They're flowering after 6 years. The white skunk cabbage, in the wet hollows. And it's just like, it's like a miracle. Yeah.
So perhaps last question?
When is the bridge scheduled working?
We have a year of funding ahead of us now. There's going to be big funding. This is one of the big hurdles we've got to get over now is getting the funding together this year, so there's enough money together by the end of the year to start making a start, because there's a super sewer going down the length of the Thames, which is, you could drive juggernauts down it. Not that you'd want to. But it takes all the water off and everything off the streets, and that's going down the centre. But our 2 feet have to be in before that started. And our project has to be finished before that starts in 2018. So we're hoping to be planting end of 2017, planting into spring of 2018, opening in May or June 2018. So it's frighteningly fast, and there's a lot of pressure on this job. I've left Sarah, our landscape architect, who's working on it, looking very nervous yesterday, because we've got to get all our tendering out and agreed by the end of next week. Yep.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you.